Well, welcome everybody to IPPNW Canada's August Speaker Series. This is a monthly event hosted by the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada for our active members, community members, and anybody who's interested in the purposes of IPPNW Canada. This month, we will be having the introduction done by AJ, our student board member. Pass that off to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to start today's speaker session with a land acknowledgement. So as we come together in this virtual space, let's take a moment to acknowledge the land from which we connect. I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat and Wendat Nation, who have cared for this land for generations. While we gather across different lands and territories, it's important to recognize that each of us is situated on lands with deep-rooted histories and ongoing relationships between Indigenous peoples and the earth. These lands have been and continue to be the home and meeting place for diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. In this virtual meeting, we reflect on our responsibilities as caretakers of the land and commit to supporting the process of reconciliation, honoring the treaties, and respecting the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. May we continue to educate ourselves and others about the histories and cultures of the Indigenous communities whose land we inhabit and work towards a future rooted in respect, justice, and understanding. So that's our land acknowledgement for tonight. I'd like to give a quick introduction to today's event. So once again, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's monthly speaker series. My name is AJ Rahman. I'm a current student member on the board at IPPNWC, and it's my immense privilege to moderate today's session. We're here to explore the takeaways emerging from the recent NPT review preparatory committee as we navigate a world increasingly marked by a retreat from previous commitments to disarmament. As we gather today, the global narrative surrounding nuclear disarmament is at a critical juncture. Despite decades of dialogue and negotiation, we find ourselves in a situation where nuclear armed states are not only failing to fulfill their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT, but are actively modernizing and expanding their arsenals. This alarming trend not only heightens the risk of nuclear conflict, but also undermines the very foundation of the NPT itself. In this context, the recent preparatory committee meetings in Geneva have highlighted just how deep these divisions have become. The inability to reach consensus on even procedural matters speaks volumes about the current state of international relations and the erosion of the cooperative spirit that once defined the NPT process. However, it's important to remember that all is not lost. But for this to happen, we must renew our collective commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons. This is not just a legal or political issue, it's a moral imperative. And today we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. John Guilfoyle and Marney Cuff-Eisenbarth, whose introductions I'll be giving shortly. They will share their reflections on the recent UN PrepCom meetings for the review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in Geneva, and they will provide us with valuable insights into the key discussions and experiences they had at these sessions, offering their expert perspectives on the current state of nuclear disarmament worldwide. So just some short biographies of our speakers today. Dr. John Guilfoyle is the current president of IPPNWC with a diverse career in medicine. His roles have included family practice in rural Newfoundland and Manitoba, chief medical officer of health for Manitoba, and chief medical officer in a small Caribbean country. He later directed the family medicine residency program at the University of Manitoba and worked with the J. Hilda's Northern Medical Unit, focusing on the Indigenous health and obstetrics in Sioux Lookout, Ontario. John received a fellowship in women's health from the College of Family Physicians of Canada. He continues this work part-time and volunteers with the International Women's Health Program of SOGC. Recently, he has been involved in developing and delivering the ALARM International Program for Healthcare Administrators in Uganda and Ethiopia. Marney Cuff-Eisenbarth is a passionate advocate for social justice and nuclear safety. While studying radiation biology at McMaster University, she developed a deep concern for nuclear issues. Marney later pursued social policy with a focus on Indigenous peoples who are disproportionately impacted by nuclear activities. She has been actively involved with Voice of Women, ICANN, and has participated in United Nations events on nuclear disarmament. Marney's activism blends grassroots organizing with lobbying for social change, working on promoting a nuclear-free, safe, and peaceful world, especially for marginalized communities. Now I'd like to hand it off to both John and Marney.
Thank you so much, AJ, and welcome everybody. It's just wonderful to be here and have a chance to share with you. From July 20th, for 2 weeks, the PrepCom, the second session of it, was held in Geneva, and Marney and I were there for the first week with an IPPNW delegation. What I wanted to do before we kind of launch into our particular reflections is just to give a slight overview of the NPT. The NPT is really the oldest piece of non-proliferation, or not non-proliferation, but it's really the first attempt to control nuclear weapons. And let me move it on to show you that I actually have a slide of the, just a second now. Oh, we seem to be, okay, sorry, maybe I needed to do that. Oh, I know what I'm doing. I'm pushing the button the wrong way. You know, that never works. Anyway, so this is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was started to be thought about in 1958. It was proposed to the United Nations initially by the Foreign Affairs Minister of, believe it or not, Ireland in 1958. It took them another 10 years to negotiate it, and it was up for signing in 1968, and it was eventually adhered to in various forms by most countries in the world. The only countries that are not signatories are South Sudan, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. The fact that the majority of those actually possess nuclear weapons should give us some cause for concern. That all said, this gives you an idea of the global nature, and that is very much a piece that the proponents of the NPT point to. This is really the only nuclear disarmament architecture that encompasses most of the world. Okay, so moving on from that, we have the world is divided up into, in terms of, this is the current situation. The blue are the nuclear weapons-free zones, which gives you a sense of what part of the world does not have nuclear weapons or shelter under them. The next one are nuclear sharing, of which Canada is one, and you can see that quite a lot of the world is nuclear under the nuclear umbrella, and the nuclear weapon states actually do, you know, have quite a large portion of the world's population. So that's just to give you a little sense of the haves, the have-nots, and who all of these nations except Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and what was the other one? Anyway, we're all present, except for maybe some very small nations who didn't have the resources to maybe send somebody to this particular treaty. Anyway, so the treaty is sort of, it goes by two phrases I heard repeated often: the grand bargain. And the grand bargain was that the nuclear weapon states were to keep the rest of the world safe. That was sort of the story back in the 1970s, as long as the rest of the world didn't get nuclear weapons, because that was seen as a bad idea. It essentially, though, has three pillars. And the first pillar really is non-proliferation. And that's why it's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because most of the articles, or at least the greater portion of the articles of the treaty, deal with non-proliferation. Disarmament is Article 6, and it was just that the countries who had nuclear weapons in 1970 would negotiate in good faith towards disarmament. This was actually tested in the International Court of Justice, and that is not just that in good faith. They are legally bound by a ruling at the International Court of Justice to actually get to disarmament. It isn't just that they need to negotiate, they actually have to have an endpoint. And then the last pillar is promote useful uses of nuclear power, peaceful uses, peaceful and useful uses of nuclear power. One of the really partners within the treaty, and I think a very important one, is the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, this is an agency that was set up actually in 1953 after Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. And it was seen as an important international body that would help to really promote a safe, secure, and peaceful use of nuclear technologies and to protect humanity from the ill effects of radiation. So it was established in 1957, and it established additional protocols in 1977 that have expanded its role to involve and sees itself as the premium agency for the management of nuclear power across the planet. Now, they have no real window on nuclear weapons. That's a state secret, and I'm not quite sure who monitors the nuclear weapon side of things, but their role is nuclear power and its various applications. They're very important because they are sitting at the table beside the chairman of this review conference. They have a very important role in terms of managing the nuclear situation. Okay. And basically, I'm not sure if I should go on to the special session on disarmament before, Marney, we maybe talk about what we saw at the conference. I'd wanted to talk about the NPT is not the only disarmament architecture. There are other pieces, but maybe I'll just leave that for the moment and maybe just get you to reflect on your particular thoughts. And you've been to a number of international gatherings, and so it would be maybe useful to share with your particular observations and perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll stop sharing for the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you to the organizers for putting this together, and thank you for inviting me to share my experience of this NPT, and especially thank you to everyone who showed up to hopefully learn a little bit more about this important issue. In terms of my background with the United Nations and nuclear disarmament, I have long attended Treaty to Prohibit the Nuclear Weapons sessions and the follow-up meetings of states parties, as well as the annual Commission on the Status of Women in terms of issues related to women, peace, and security. This was my first NPT. Quite a different kettle of fish. I think the best way to describe what I experienced was it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I thought at this point, to get the ugly stuff out of the way, that I would comment on a couple of very contemporary, very current realities that are so connected to the NPT. It's not all bad news, but this is two things that I'm sure everyone's quite aware of. One of them has to do with the current conflicts. So there's a big fear. Much of what the fears around nuclear weapons has to do with this mantra of deterrence is going to save us, and that's one of the fears. And people looking to nuclear disarmament is that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is proving that deterrence works. We don't want that. So that's just something when you're following what's going on with that conflict. The other thing the Russia-Ukraine conflict has done, it has rumblings in Europe for Europe to become nuclear armed states again. Right now, there's the umbrella with the US where they have nuclear weapons in Germany and elsewhere. What what Germany initiated this is to get a trilateral umbrella in Europe with Europe, France, and Germany. They wouldn't have to, then the NPT, whoever has nuclear weapons as of that date, January 1st, they can keep their weapons, right? So you could still have a trilateral umbrella in Europe because you can use France's. Germany can have nuclear weapons on their airplanes because they're hosting them. They're not owning them. They belong to France. So that's another big concern. Those are things we have to keep in mind when we're watching all this unfold. And it also is a good reason for us to continue, regardless of how disappointed we may get with UN meetings, in particular the NPT, because these things are constantly happening as conflicts unfold. We need to be there. We need to witness this, and we need to share that information. So I just wanted to put that out there. The other big thing, the US election. Okay, I'm not American, but I spent quite a bit of time speaking with someone who I've known for a long time in the nuclear, a lawyer from affiliated with the UN, Jackie Cabasso in the US. And so, on the one hand, if you think if Kamala Harris gets in that everything's going to be rosy when it comes to nuclear weapons, absolutely not. Because ever since World War II, it's been the same, and it will. The idea is that the understanding is that the U.S. will not change their post-war and post-Cold War mantra of deterrence, and that the threatened use of nuclear weapons is what keeps them going, and that has been since the 40s. And that is not going to change. So there is no some president's going to get us to nuclear disarmament. That's not the message that anyone in the States who knows much more about it than I am. The problem is going to come if Trump comes in because of his Project 2025. And I'll just, this is how she described, so if Trump, this is how some people in the know would describe what would happen with regard to nuclear weapons, it would mean implementing the most dramatic buildup of nuclear weapons since the start of the Reagan administration 40 years ago. If this ultra-conservative political coalition gets its way in November, in terms of the scope, the pace, and the cost of U.S. nuclear weapons programs would increase all at once. So that's the big concern. So these are things we have to keep our fingers on the pulse of to see how it's going. But it's not the happiest news, but if we still need to know, so we know where to put our energies to get positive outcomes. I don't know, I think I'll hand it back to you, John, if you want to do that, because there is a lot of positive things coming out of it, but I thought maybe the conflict stuff first.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll jump in, and I mean, this was my first foray into seeing how decisions are made in this kind of very rarefied space of concerning themselves with what is one of the few pieces of the disarmament architecture. And to be quite honest, it's a well choreographed dance with parts being played by the various players. The various nuclear weapon states have positions and they're not changing them. Pillar number one, disarmament, is dead in the water. There was no discussion, not a peep. There is no action whatsoever in that regard. Non-proliferation is, there's almost, I would say, a farcical approach to non-proliferation. We have the United States who have baked in, because they managed to place weapons in Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Turkey prior to 1970. So that didn't count as proliferation. And they are standing with an absolutely straight face castigating Russia for putting weapons in Belarus. And I mean, it is, you know, I mean, it's theater in some ways, but and there is this notion that proliferation has been stopped, you know, that the treaty has been successful. The reality is that the number of nuclear weapon states who have acquired nuclear weapons since the treaty has almost doubled. There are 4 nuclear weapon states who actually have weapons and aren't even part of the treaty. So the treaty has failed in terms of non-proliferation, but that isn't seen as a failure. You know what I mean? It's just regrettable that these 4 nations aren't there, and the fact that there aren't more is the success of non-proliferation, and I guess that's a reasonable stance. But from another perspective is that really the outlook of the treaty and its success is limited. The issue that I really would point to is the role of the peaceful uses. Much was made, and there is huge support for the ongoing expansion of nuclear power. And the IAEA, which is the regulatory authority, which is to keep us safe, was at the forefront of this. They had a huge exhibition at the hallway going into the conference there all week, outlining all the wonderful peaceful uses of nuclear power, which are true. I mean, isotopes, food safety, crops, you know, radiocarbon dating, all of that is all absolutely useful. But there is somehow a disconnect that the fact that they're expanding nuclear power, and particularly producing small modular nuclear reactors, increases the threat of non-proliferation. And one of the things that really wasn't considered, and I believe is one of the real things, is the reality of nuclear power plants being pre-positioned bombs, and that there are no robust measures for keeping the world safe from nuclear power plants in the event of conflict. The IAEA have established 7 principles, but these are totally, you know what I mean? These will disappear in the first artillery shell. There is no mechanism, and the IAEA, while paying great lip service to protecting the health of humanity, or at least showing that they are keeping people safe, have no mechanisms for doing that. And so the IAEA, I think, are in a conflict of interest in as much as they are focused on the safety and security of nuclear power and its technologies, but their view does not involve public health. And what I found was extraordinary. There is no input of the World Health Organization into any of the deliberations of the NPT. The IAEA is the only voice that is responsible for health, which I think is a lamentable deficiency, and to some extent is echoed by the behavior of regulatory authorities, nuclear regulatory authorities across the world. And Canada is really no exception. The recent appointment of Mr. Tremblay, with no knowledge of public health and with a huge portfolio of promoting the nuclear industry, is now in charge of the regulatory authority. So, I mean, as somebody had pointed out in this recent letter that was sent by 80 civil society organizations, pointing out that the communications, the health department at our CNSC in Canada has 1 person, and the communications department has 60. So that will give you some idea of the weight that is put between promotion and protection in terms of looking at the wider public health. So I felt, this is my bias, of course, that this was echoed, that there is and it echoes also what happened at the G20, or not the G20, but COP, when the G20, the 20 most affluent nations in the world, are totally behind nuclear power. And yes, the rest of the nations of the world are saying, we're not either there or we would like to take a pass on that. So this was something which I think, in terms of looking to the future, we really need to help the public and our profession question, why is public health not at the forefront of the management of the threats from the nuclear industry? Because they range from everything from the nuclear bombs to waste disposal. There is an impressive challenge to public health in the whole spectrum of the nuclear industry. So anyway, I just wanted to share that that is not even on the table at the NPT. They are gung-ho about expanding nuclear power, and the IAEA are even on record now saying that it is a major solution to the climate crisis, that it needs to be viewed in this regard. The other thing which was passing strange in terms of just what happened there, now the AUKUS Defense Pact, which is between Australia and the US and Japan and all of that, they're now transporting fissile material, which is the stuff you can make into nuclear weapons, to submarines in Australia. US is transporting, you know what I mean? They are transporting fissile material from the US to Australia for their use. And this is peaceful. Right? And so this was, you know, again, a question of the peaceful uses clause of this treaty, because there were certainly countries there that were asking, how come, you know, not arming, but providing fissile material to another country is peaceful use, you know, with the potential of diversion and all of that. And the answers from Australia was, well, we couldn't ever do anything like that. It will only be used for nuclear submarines, and only for defensive purposes. Like, we would never use these nuclear submarines to, you know, attack or do anything like that. So, I mean, some of this seems, to me at least, a little disingenuous, you know, in terms of so those are some of the substantive kind of things that we heard when we were there. But there were side conversations. And I just wanted to share with you one side conversation, which I found extremely interesting, because one of the things that some countries are saying is that the NPT is really moribund, that it is not going to go anywhere. And the TPNW, unfortunately, is hampered by the fact that the nuclear weapon states will have nothing to do with it. And those in their umbrella, generally speaking, are saying we want nothing to do with the TPNW because it is too granular in its prohibition of nuclear weapons. I mean, if you sign the TPNW, you would next morning have to start disarming, because you know what I mean? It would be just, you would be holding two opposing thoughts that don't make sense at the same time. So one of the things that came up was the thing called a special session on disarmament. Now, I'd be interested to poll the audience. Does anybody out there, please, know anything about special sessions on disarmament? I hear a chorus of no's. I don't, just a second, somebody's just knocked at my door. I need to go deep with it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm on a Zoom meeting.
I would
Sorry?
just add to John.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm just
thing about this, the side meetings in the hallway. I mean, so much gets accomplished in speaking in the hallways with ambassadors, that which is another reason why, regardless of how negative you may feel about the NPT, there's so much positive happens underneath and off the record, and some of it very much off the record. But anyway, sorry, that was just white noise in the middle for you, John.
Okay. No, okay. I see somebody with a hand up. Please tell me, Clara.
Yeah, I feel like this is, I didn't know exactly what you meant at first by special sessions, but then Marney clarified. When I went to Geneva for the Biological Weapons Convention, I also participated in the side events, and you're right, a lot of stuff happens in the side events, that mainly more private discussions that aren't discussed in open debate.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And so now I am going to share some PowerPoints. And I just want to, I was invited to a side event which was hosted by a group called SCRAP, which is, their strategic concepts on arms reduction, I think, and also a couple of countries, Brazil, Austria and Mexico were there, and there was the International Peace Bureau and the Middle East Treaty Organization. There were a number of people who were there, and let me share. They talked about special session for disarmament. Now, a special session started, really, the concept started in 1978. And, you know, just to show you how disarmament has not been on the global agenda, it was a follow-on from the 1932 General Disarmament Conference at the League of Nations. So disarmament doesn't get a lot of playtime. 149 committees participated, and it led to the Committee on Disarmament. And it set a final document, which is quite important in terms of both United Nations history and also setting out the framework on disarmament. And this framework in this final document included stopping nuclear tests, establishing nuclear weapons-free zones, reducing military budgets, and implementing confidence-building measures. So that was the first special session on disarmament. And it had a very ambitious final document, which then became the really the guide for the next session on disarmament, which was in 1982. Well, if anybody remembers 1982, whatever hope there was in 78, in 1982, we were getting into really the height of the Cold War. No significant progress on disarmament, and it didn't produce a final document. But they did agree on a program for fellowships on disarmament. Good for them. In 1988, there was another session, this third special session, and there was no significant progress, but it was agreed that there should be a fourth special session. And this is really what I want to talk about, okay? This is what was the subject of this particular consultation. And its purpose really was to kind of work. There is another, and this is part of the architecture of disarmament. There is another, as well as the special sessions that I had talked about, there is a conference on disarmament, which was really started out of the first session. And it became kind of a working body that was independent of this first special session, but worked along with it. And the conference on disarmament, which was started out of it, became the Committee on Disarmament, which continues to this day and has been very important in, it drafted the documents for the NPT. It drafted the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So the point I want to make is that the notion of having special sessions on disarmament and focused work on them is quite important and has produced results to this point. The only problem is that, and this is really a little poster for what the meeting I went to. This is so this is supported by Pugwash. It's supported by IPPNW, UNAK, a bunch of organizations. And basically what it's proposing is that we should go back and try and create a process, reinvigorate the real activity that happened in the first special session, and move towards creating what would essentially be another COP, but disarmament as its purpose. So in other words, we would have a COP for climate change, but we would also work towards having a COP for disarmament, because the point that's being made is that nuclear disarmament is only one piece of a fairly large pie. And in fact, so much suffering worldwide and displacement and all of these attendant problems are being caused by conventional wars. And that at this point, we must focus on disarmament because we desperately need to have everything from small and light weapons to all of the other mechanisms that are in place where women, children in the main are harmed, need to come to the fore. And there needs to be now a special session on disarmament that will then, it circumvents the Security Council, because it then becomes something that the General Assembly can act on outside of the Security Council, which has largely blocked so many efforts for disarmament. I mean, and that's part of the reason why the NPT isn't working, is because really the Security Council are in a position where any movement can be blocked. So that was one of the, I think, one of the exciting things. And I'm not going to go on too much more about that. There's lots of information, because the other thing that this links to is the Summit for the Future, which is really what they've recognized at the United Nations, is that the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're now more than halfway to 2030, are now going to, they're maybe 17% on track, 20% if we're lucky. The rest, there's over 50% of them are not likely to be achieved. And the Summit of the Future, which is actually, they're having the final meeting in September in New York, is an attempt to try and set an agenda. And they're creating a document called Pact for the Future, which has got some focus on disarmament and some focus on, and it's hoped that that also will be an impetus that this special session on disarmament will get some serious consideration, because the moment it's felt by many nations is that it's above time that we started some serious concern about doing something different than the NPT. So I just wanted to share that, because not all about the NPT that we discussed was about the NPT. There was also some forward thinking, as I described here. So with that, I think we might open it for questions or a conversation together. Oh yeah, this is the Summit for the Future. Its sub-theme is multilateral solutions for a better tomorrow, accelerating deliveries of the SDGs, because there's a deepening trade-off between development and climate action, and this is not working. And so developing frameworks for multilateralism, and there is a Pact for the Future, which you can Google and look up, which is a very forward-looking document talking about what are some of the particular activities that need to be done. And as I've mentioned, some of them are certainly in the wheelhouse of IPPNWC. So I'll stop screen sharing with that.
Yes.